Hi, thanks for clicking play on this Context Special Edition. We are busy working on the third installation of our four-part series, where we will be focusing on how economy and environment interrelate, and we'll be posting that soon. But in light of the increase in awareness and publicity about the use of weapons in our nation, from terrorists to hate crimers to mentally unstable gunmen, to police brutality and violations of civil liberties, or to retaliatory actions by frustrated citizens, it is evident that the rise in personal use of force needs to have some context placed on it. The list I just mentioned is long, with many intersections at play for each specific situation. And so, as this is a special short edition of Context, we'll save the more complex analysis of intersections for a future episode. For now, we're going to simplify and talk about one element that all parties engaging in interactions in which a police officer or a potential suspect must keep in mind, and that is the law. Luckily for us, the law is a double-edged sword, and it slices both ways, sometimes traumatically so, from a person who pleads guilty and faces a longer penalty than a defendant who doesn't, to loss of life for either suspect or officer. There is one truth that applies universally. A police officer's job is to protect, not to persecute. Our Constitution is clear that each citizen in our society deserves a right to a trial by jury in matters where death could be the result of them being found guilty. And that guilt is determined by a jury of the defendant's peers, unless the defendant requests a trial with just a judge making the decision for them. But the Constitution guarantees that any individual whose life may be taken for an act they are found guilty for having perpetrated deserves a right to trial in front of a jury. And this means that the police in no way have the right to determine whether a person is guilty. They do not have the right to make the decision about that person's life or loss of life based on whether they believe that person to be guilty. The Constitution also does not give a police officer the right to kill intentionally. They have the right to do all in their power to bring a person to justice and to protect people's safety, but they cannot enact the justice themselves. The police officers in our country face a society where nothing is obvious. As we've spoken about in previous episodes of Context, the reality is there are many, many different cultural standards at play, and it is simply the Constitution that guarantees certain liberties and rights. It's also what makes our country great, because we have such variety. But that does make it challenging for a neutral police officer to be able to read all situations neutrally. Based on their own indoctrination, the way that they were raised in their own cultural values, or their own misunderstanding of another culture's values, all these can interrelate as forces that influence a police officer's behavior in a specific situation. So the society that police officers are working in is not obvious, but the rules that they operate and function under are very specific. Now, this places an unfair burden on officers, and for them choosing to take on such a frontline role in tending to the peace of our country and our society, they deserve respect, care, and not to be challenged without cause. And they have the added burden of never being the cause of our mistrust. When an officer chooses to kill instead of stop a suspect, they have taken upon themselves the judge and jury role in our society, and it is not their job. What is their job is to protect. It is true that each citizen needs to help them do their job, but it is up to the elevated responsibility of our empowered officers to know and to show restraint in order to protect all involved, including the suspect. All too often, the fate of a suspect is left to an officer to determine. And this is because of the heightened emotions that are present in escalating situations. But an officer taking the responsibility on of judge and jury can violate the civil liberty rights of that particular suspect and place our officers in positions that they are just not trained to do. Our Constitution, which is designed under the small d democratic principles, asserts that it is a judge's responsibility to be trained well enough to be able to determine what rules apply to an individual suspect in order to help persecute them the proper way. This includes giving instructions to a jury so that they understand what evidence they should consider, all for the purpose of making sure that that defendant receives the fairest trial possible under the principles of small d democracy. Police officers are not trained to understand those specific details. They are trained to protect. Now, an officer's right to self-protection is absolutely important. An officer's job to protect all others is as well, from suspect to bystander. It is this intersection of triple responsibility that makes police work the job of the skilled police officer, aka the skilled protector. And so the questions we as a society are left to answer are, how can we, as individual members of society, help officers maintain peace and rebuild trust? But we must also ask, what is our bar as a country for how skilled our officers are? Do we value spending our pooled resources, aka taxes, for military-grade weapons that any level of skilled officer could deploy? Or do we value training our police officers so they are deeply aware of their role to protect others and can do so in times of stressful, escalated situations, so that the suspects can have their day in front of a judge and jury of their peers? These are questions regarding how much we value small d democracy, because a culture that does all it can to give a suspect, even the most heinous one, their day in court, and does not accept any behaviors by the empowered officials of our government if it undermines the citizens' faith and trust in our small d democracy. There is no doubt that the trauma of these tragedies extends beyond the participants or even the bystanders, and it presents a challenge for us as a society to address what standards we expect for our culture. Where is that bar, and to what degree we are willing to participate, contribute, and financially support the proper training of anyone who is in a position of authority, and to what degree each of us will be responsible citizens for the sake of our families, our communities, and for our country.